And that's what we're going to do today with Ben, who's very kindly offered to share with the community a way to save money, I think it's fair to say, but also to explore some of those services that you might not already have access to in your go-to space for your Microsoft tools. So without further ado, I'm going to say feel free to ask questions, and I'm going to hand over to Ben and say a very warm welcome to Ben, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thanks, John. And yeah, I was just looking at how many people are here and trying to think how I want to handle questions because, frankly, I love to handle questions as we go. But there's also a lot of people here. So, John, I don't know if you want to pay attention to, like, if people are raising hands. So if someone does have a question as I go and they want to throw up a hand, maybe, John, you can kind of keep track and interrupt me if people have questions and go that way. You can also try to throw them in the chat.
Yeah.
I do have the chat up, so I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. And if I miss something there, John, and you see something that's relevant, I'll designate John as the official interrupter of my presentation for questions that people may have.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that role, Ben. I like to be the interrupter, so I will come on camera and I'll wave at you when we've got some questions if we need them.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Well, thanks again, John. We're going to talk about unlocking significant cost savings with Logic Apps. I'm going to go through some of the pricing here. This is something I see a lot of people kind of glossing over, but we'll also talk about Logic Apps as a whole today and do some comparison. I'll show you Logic Apps. I'll show you Power Automate and walk you through just kind of all the things when we kind of look at Logic Apps versus Power Automate. William asked where I am. I am in Jacksonville, Florida. So a little bit about me before we dive in. I have my own company. I do Microsoft 365, Azure consulting. I've been doing it now, man, I think I started my company in 2012, 11 and a half years. I've been doing it. I've been working with SharePoint specifically since the 2005, 2006 timeframe. I also have a podcast. If you want to go check that out, myself and another friend of mine here in Jacksonville, Scott Hogue, do the podcast all about Microsoft 365, Azure, a little bit more IT Pro admin focused. Recently, Microsoft MVP as of this year. I got the first MVP award ever back in January, but also get Microsoft certified in Azure, certified in cybersecurity, certified. So I enjoy the Microsoft Cloud. If you do want to reach out to me, there's my email address. Feel free to drop me an email. At the end, I have Twitter, LinkedIn. Those are probably the best two ways to connect with me, other than my email and my website. So diving into the topic today, and hopefully Teams background filtering is working because our lawn guy just showed up to mow our lawn. So I have a lawnmower going outside my office window right now. Pricing. How do these two compare when it comes to pricing? I should have put headers on here. On the left, I actually swapped my pricing. This is what I get for doing this the day after the 4th of July. On the left, you have your Logic Apps pricing and some different options for Logic Apps with the link for Logic Apps on the right. And on the right, you have all the options for pricing when it comes to Power Automate and the link to it on the bottom. So if you get the slides, I think because I'm sharing this live too, you should be able to even click on them. Oh, someone said you're still seeing the header page and not the pricing page.
That's moved along for me onto the pricing page, Ben, just to let you know. Sometimes, Debbie, and we do have these challenges with Teams, sometimes it can lag. So sometimes it does help if you simply leave the call and come back and it'll just synchronize up for you. Or if you have a pop out somewhere, sometimes that can cause you problems. That's really interesting. Yeah, so some are seeing your pricing page and some not, Ben. Let me take myself off Spotlight. That might help.
There may be a bit of a lag. I can call out the slide numbers too if you do have to move it yourself. So this is the pricing page, which is slide 3. And kind of talking through this, let's start with Logic Apps. So Logic Apps does have 2 different pricing plans. And we can go see these when we look at Logic Apps. But they have a standard plan, which is almost like you're buying a dedicated machine to run these Logic Apps on. You're going to pay a little bit more for this one. So I would say if you start comparing standard plans to Power Automate, you're not going to see necessarily that cost savings because you are paying per hour for virtual CPU, for memory, and you still have some of the connector pricing on it. Standard is not one we're going to look at today. Frankly, when I start comparing Logic Apps and Power Automate, I tend to look more at the consumption plan, the second one, where a consumption plan, you don't have a dedicated environment. It's a shared environment. You're sharing the backend compute resources that are running the Logic Apps, and then you are simply paying based on triggers, based on actions, and based on connectors. And you're going to start seeing a lot of similar terminology here as we talk about the 2. And truth be told, someone I think mentioned this to John earlier, is when it comes down to it, Power Automate is the Microsoft 365 service built on top of Logic Apps. So you really will see a lot of similarities here. I saw a question too I wanted to look at. Logic Apps involves virtual machines. Sort of, Sydney, although you would never actually see the virtual machines. When you talk about the standard plan, it's more paying for dedicated resources. I will say I am very interested to see how this transpires over time. I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent. John gave me 2 hours. I might take every bit of it. InfoPath was announced that it is going to be retiring in 3 years. SharePoint workflows have also started to get retired in the cloud. I'm really curious to see if you're going to start getting some ability to run some of these services in some sort of on-premises manner. And I would say this is looking really long term. InfoPath is not going to be retired now till 2026. They gave us a full 3 years of InfoPath on-prem yet. SharePoint workflows have started to see the end of life a little sooner, more online, not necessarily on-prem. So while they don't run directly on a virtual machine, it will be interesting to see if you're going to get some of that ability down the road. When it comes to Logic Apps today, and we start talking about virtual CPU memory, it's going to be primarily for you want to pay for dedicated resources. Maybe you want these to run a little bit faster. You want to know you have a dedicated environment. The compliance stuff could get into the standard plan a little bit as well because you are now paying for that dedicated environment versus using shared. I hesitate to go that way because it's not like on a shared environment you're going to get access to somebody else's Logic Apps. So those are kind of the 2 big things when it comes to Logic Apps. When it comes to Power Automate, it is licensed very differently for the most part. First, you have the free one. This is the one where everything is included with or the stuff that's included with Microsoft 365, Office 365, any Office 365 plan, E1, small business, E5, E3, business premium, they're all going to get this free Power Automate license. The one downside, and this is where I see a lot of people starting to get tripped up, is that it's missing those premium connectors. And the connectors that there are some connectors that actually used to be free that have since moved to premium, specifically a lot of the connectors to Azure. So if you're doing things with something like Azure SQL or Azure Automation, you want to connect to Azure AD in certain ways. Azure AD is kind of the one exception here, in terms of there is an Azure AD free connector for Office 365 that's not premium. But yeah, a lot of those premium connectors, and as people build more and more advanced Power Automate flows, they want those premium connectors. In order to get premium connectors, you would either have to do a per user license, and per user license in Power Automate gives a single user unlimited flows per user. And this is, I'm going to clarify this because I ran into this question the other day having a discussion with somebody. This is not per users that connect to Power Automate. So if you build a flow and you use a single service account to connect to all your services, premium connectors, let's say you want to connect to SQL. You have a user, that's a service account, that's licensed for premium and connects to SQL, but you have 500 people using that Automate flow or benefiting. The terminology Microsoft actually uses benefiting from that flow. They also have to have a premium license. I have had some people come to me and say, well, we just need a license one user for premium because we just have one user actually connecting and using those premium connectors. And Microsoft's terms of service, from a technical legal perspective, says everybody that benefits from the Power Automate flow that has a premium connector has to have a premium license. So if you're doing per user, license every user that's benefiting from that premium connector. If you don't want to do that, and this is absolutely sitting down and weighing out the cost of the different options, you can license per flow with a 5-flow minimum. And this allows you to have a minimum of 5 flows, and then you can add on top of that. But this license is for that flow to have premium connectors and an unlimited number of users. So when you start looking at per user, per flow, you can maybe mix and match them. Most of the time, you're probably either going to do a per user or a per flow. Now, the last interesting one, and we're going to look at this one a little bit more because it definitely makes this conversation a little bit more interesting from a pricing perspective, is pay as you go. Power Automate now does give you a pay as you go option where you can use premium connectors and you only pay when a flow is using a premium connector when that flow actually runs. And this, you'll see some of the pricing difference. It definitely makes Power Automate a little bit more approachable for some of those premium connectors. I will say in certain cases, Logic Apps does still tend to be cheaper. So I'm going to pause a minute before I jump to the next slide and look through. Were there any questions in here, John, kind of around this?
Yeah, some really interesting ones, actually. So let's start at the bottom. There's how free is free? At what point are we going to get forced to pay for more actions and API calls? Was one from Mark.
Yeah, so but how free is free? At what point? So, Mark, I would say free is free. I do a lot of stuff with free. I will say that. If you're connecting to SharePoint lists, particularly, or if you're building certain flows that resolve a little bit more around email, connecting to SharePoint, maybe sending alerts to Teams, I would say there's a lot of stuff you can do with free. I do think more and more people, as they get used to Power Automate, free is, like you said, not really free anymore. People start wanting to connect to HTTP endpoints and making REST calls, and they want to start connecting to some of the Azure services. My big one, Azure Automation all the time. there's even some goofy ones with like the Graph API. I think there's a free Graph API connector. But that's where I really do see a lot more people wanting these premium connectors. I think that's also why Microsoft did introduce this pay-as-you-go. Because for those people using Power Automate that don't want to venture into Logic Apps, it gives a much more approachable pricing option. But I do see your point that I don't know that the free version seems to be less satisfactory for more and more people. People are wanting to do more and more. That's pushing them into these paid plans.
Couple of really interesting questions. I'm gonna pick on this one if this is all right, because I think you might frame it for those people who are perhaps slightly less familiar with the concept of Logic Apps versus Power Apps. But Joshua's just sort of asked, is it easy for an end user to use Logic Apps in the same way they might do? And I know you're going to demo this, Ben. I know sort of what the answer is. Similar to Power Automate, or do they really need to be created by IT? And this is probably a big spoiler for the session, but I think it's a really interesting one to dwell on now.
It is absolutely end users. It is very approachable for end users. IT needs to be involved a little bit more from the setup standpoint, as I'll show you, but in terms of actually creation of them, very much approachable by end users. I would say maybe a touch more training. I'll show you a few things when we get to it, but short answer is yes, absolutely approachable for end users.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Another one from Joshua before we move on is, if you use an action like compose or a variable that does not have a connector, are these actions free in Logic Apps?
No, you pay, and we'll go look at this pricing page. You pay for everything in Logic Apps. So while you're saying that, let's go look at these pricing pages. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're just going to navigate over and look at these differences and how you get charged when it comes to these different things. So Power Automate, we talked about this one, so I'm going to start here. And this is where it quickly starts adding up. A per user plan for Power Automate, the one where we talked about everybody that needs to run those premium connectors, it's $15 per user per month. So you can see that's going to ramp up in a hurry. You very quickly end up in the hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars. Per user, this $40 a month is if you want to start doing some of the RPA stuff. We're not going to look at those desktop flows, the robotic process automation. We're going to kind of just ignore this one for now. If you want to do RPA, maybe we can do another session sometime on RPA. But per license, this is that base license that will give you unlimited flows per user and still be able to use those premium connectors. We also talked about that per flow plan, where unlimited people can run it, but you're paying for every single flow you create. This one, you're going to start right off the bat, $500 per month, because of that minimum of 5 flows. Again, you can see if you have thousands of people and you're just writing one flow, this very easily could be a cheaper option based on those flows, based on your particular scenario and what you're trying to create. Pay-as-you-go, this is where it starts getting really interesting. Pay-as-you-go now allows you to run a flow with a premium connector for only 60 cents. I say only 60 cents. I've seen people that run hundreds and hundreds of flows per month. You're still going to rack up there. If you're running 100 flows, you're at 60 cents. I've got to do my math right now. You're going to be at $60 a month running a flow 100 times. So definitely more approachable than some of these, especially maybe you have a flow that runs 30 times. It's only running once per month. You're just going to start paying a few bucks per run for that particular flow. And you can even use premium connectors. If you do want to get into RPA, you'll see some of these other ones. If you license a flow by run and you want to use some of those RPA processes, you do have some pay-as-you-go options there too. But this introduction, Power Automate pricing, this is how it's going to work. Now we jump over to Logic Apps, and you asked about the paying for everything. Standard plan, this is where I mentioned you pay for that vCPU, you pay for memory. You asked earlier, I think it was Sydney asked earlier about virtual machines. This is also where you see this does start supporting development on Windows, Linux, Mac, some custom connector extensions. There are some benefits to the standard plan. This is going to absolutely get a little bit more developer-y, very specific use cases for Logic apps. We're not going to spend any time looking at this one. We're going to focus on this consumption plan. So that question is, are you paying for everything? Yep, you're paying for everything. Every condition, every action, and you can see it. Triggers, actions, connectors. If you click add a new action into your Logic app, you're going to pay for that action. But that's only after you have 4,000 actions. And this is when an action runs. So think a flow runs, and we're going to go over these slides a little bit more. A flow runs and you have 10 actions in the flow. Every time that flow runs, that counts as an action being run, but you are paying 25 thousandths, I think, yes, 25, it's going to be 10 hundredths, thousandths, 25 thousandths of a cent every time it runs. And that's only after you run 4,000 actions. It takes a little while to get up there. And once you get up there, it takes a while for that to add up. There is some data retention, 12 cents per gigabyte per month. This one, again, probably a negligible cost. I have never run into where data retention is anything worth paying attention to. And then you get down to your standard enterprise connectors. So think of these again as your premium connectors and standard connectors. Every time you add a standard connector to a flow, that is going to be 12.5 hundredths of a cent if you want to add a standard connector. So 5, 10 standard connectors, just multiply it by that amount, and it's only when you call it. And then your enterprise connectors, more your premium connectors, are only a tenth of a cent per call. So at this pricing, well, yes, you are paying for every single action. You're paying every time that standard connector runs or that enterprise connector runs. Everything is measured in fractions of a cent. You have some more things down here. If you want this fully isolated environment, this kind of runs on top of app services. This is probably something, if you're actually just getting started with Logic Apps, comparing it to Power Automate, you're not going to have to worry about an integrated service environment, integrated accounts. All of these, again, not something that you're going to have to worry about. Asked about VMs. No, not yet, but you do have Logic Apps and Kubernetes. Arc-enabled clusters on premises. So they are starting to enter in this realm of being able to run Logic Apps as well in an on-premises environment. Right now, only on Kubernetes, or we're not going to get into that at all today. So if you're looking through pricing pages are pretty straightforward. The trickiest thing is just make sure when you're looking at this, to get started, you're flipping over to this consumption plan and looking at this pricing versus your standard plan where you're just getting going. You don't need to pay for the vCPU and memory and have that standard plan for Logic Apps. So
quick question.
Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. The pause there, Ben. So does this kind of consumption-based pricing apply to development environments and also to, let's say I'm building something in a sandbox or I'm building something in a default environment and I'm running it? I presume the consumption applies there as well?
Yeah, so when you start talking consumption plans, it's built in Azure. So you're building it in your Azure subscription. I have not looked. I would assume it's the same pricing if you're doing like a dev test Azure subscription, but you do have to think through that too, that when you get into Logic Apps versus Power Automate, is you don't have those Power Platform environments that you're building these in, the sandbox, the dev, and the production. You're building these in an Azure subscription and getting billed through your Azure pricing, and it doesn't belong in any specific Power Platform environment.
Understood. Got you. Thank you.
I lost my team sharing. So I'm going to jump back, stop that sharing, and jump back into my slides a minute. Because instead of trying to do math on the fly, and some of you may have already jumped ahead to this I wish it was easier to resume where I was sometimes. The whole sharing, there we go. This is the one I wanted. So we talked about these different licensing, and I just threw a very simple example flow together and did the math on it. Where let's say you want to do something that's triggering this from SharePoint. You're going to have your trigger, that's an action. Now you want to do an approval in it, and Logic Apps, this is something we'll look at when we start building one out, is Logic Apps does have a little bit of a different way to do approvals. You're going to be missing certain functionality that you're used to in Power Automate. Maybe you want to go run PowerShell and Azure Automation. I threw this in there because it's a premium connector. After you run your PowerShell, you want to go update the SharePoint list it was triggered from and send an email. Power Automate, you're going to be at 60 cents per run because you have that premium connector, or that minimum of $15 per user that benefits from this, or $100 for unlimited people. So your cheapest option is going to be 60 cents per run of this. It goes up from there. If you were to go do this exact same thing in Logic Apps, you start looking at the standard connectors, and we just counted them. We have a SharePoint connector. There's going to be an Outlook connector, another Outlook connector. I may have miscounted by one. There may be 5 running PowerShell and Azure Automation. You're going to have 4 or 5 connectors, which is going to run you 0.05 of a cent. You're going to have that one enterprise connector for Azure Automation that's going to run you 0.1 of a cent. You have those 6 actions every time it runs, but the first 4,000 are free, so you can run this a whole bunch of times. Let's say you hit 4,000 and you're going to start paying those 6 actions. You're going to start paying 0.06 of a cent per run at a minimum. If you hit all those actions, you're going to be paying a little over 0.06 of a cent per run at that maximum if you've exceeded your 4,000 actions. To get to 60 cents, you would have to run this flow 979 times. So this is where you really can start seeing some of that cost savings of 60 cents per run seems cheap until you go build this in Logic Apps and realize that you are paying 1,000th of that price to run it in Logic Apps. It is going to be the first 4,000 actions in that subscription, so across all of your Logic Apps. So if you're building a bunch of them, you could burn through those 4,000 actions pretty quickly in a subscription. But again, once you get through those and you're paying the 25 thousandths of a cent, it's going to be pretty quick. Mark, so if we deploy flows using a service account with no premium connectors, at what point will we run into an issue in terms of the number of runs, API calls per month? I don't remember what those limits are, Mark. I'd have to look. It's a lot. I want to say, is it like 2,000 runs per licensed user, if I remember right? But then it all goes into a pool. So if you have 5 licensed users, you get like 10,000 free runs per month, and it kind of would go up from there. I don't know that I've ever seen somebody hit it. I'm sure there are people out there that have just massive amounts of flows. But even at 2,000, if that limit is 2,000, you're looking at each person running, 30 days in a month, 2,000 flows, running 67 flows per user per day on average. I'm assuming that's your question there with it's kind of that standard runs calls per month. Correct me if I misunderstood that question. Anything else in there, John? It's the first 4,000 actions. I think that hits most of the questions, unless you saw another one, John.
No, I think you have. And just a reminder, if we do miss a question, just repost it and we'll pick it up the second time. So feel free to do that if we need to.
So this is a small example. I built a bigger one once. I have one big one I've built. And I sat down and I was like, okay, so what if I took this flow? I did this one in Power Automate. This does have premium connectors in it. I don't know how many because I wasn't about, no, this one doesn't have any premium in it. I take that back. I did this with all standard connectors. And I went and looked at the actions that are in it because I was curious at how the math breaks down. The biggest run of these, there's a lot of different conditions and branches. So the number of actions that run per flow is not the same. I looked back over the last 60 or 90 days, and the most actions that ran in a single run was 198 actions. It's all standard connectors. So at 198 actions, it's running approximately 600 actions per month. I just assumed that, let's assume they're all gone. So I'm having to pay for every actions. 6,000 actions per month is still only 0.05 of a cent for all of these actions to run this flow. The connections per run is 2.5 cents. So this entire flow of 198 actions cost me about 3 cents per run if I was to do it in Logic Apps. It's still way cheaper than that 60 cents per run. And this was all standard. If it's all premium, I flipped it around and I was like, let's say I have 198 premium actions. Doing all that same math, it's going to come out to about 20.5 cents per run. So the conclusion I kind of came to is doing the math, because I never sat down and done it for something this big before, and assuming I did all that math correctly with these weird fractions of cents, unless you're getting up into that range of building some of these Logic apps with upwards of 600 actions in them, Logic apps per run is still going to be cheaper for the most part. Again, you could start getting into maybe this is running a whole bunch of times. So instead of 6,000 actions per month, this flow runs once a day. If you have something that's running every minute and running 200 actions every minute, maybe, but you're still looking at that per run. I started going down that path and I was like, no, it doesn't matter. It's still per run. You'd have to build a really, really big Logic app to get it up to 60 cents per run. The other downside is if you don't have Azure subscriptions, if your company doesn't want to do Azure, that's going to be the other caveat there is there are still certain functionalities and features within Power Automate that you get in that 60 cents per run that you wouldn't necessarily get in Logic apps or some of those barriers to entry, primarily in Azure subscription. Sydney built one that there was 480 steps for one run. That's impressive, Sydney. So even at that though, 480 cents per run, if you're doing premium, you're still at like 40-ish cents per run. For standard connections, maybe you're doing it at like 6 cents, 6 to 10 cents per run. And it was destructive. I don't know that I'd want to touch that one, Sydney. Props to you on creating that one. But we've been talking a lot about pricing, comparing the pricing, and there have been the questions on how do you build them. We do have pricing isn't everything when you come to these. we've determined that Logic Apps, absolutely, you can do it cheaper. But what are the things do you need to think about when you're looking at Logic Apps? Microsoft does provide a comparison table in their documentation. This is by no means all-inclusive of all of the differences. And there's a few I'll try to highlight as we look at these. The focus. Logic Apps, yes, you can go in and do it if you are a end user. If you've built Power Automate, you can absolutely build Logic Apps. Microsoft will say their focus, and naturally so, is a little bit more on pro developers, admins using Office 365, more so than the end users. You have to go into Azure. You have to navigate through Azure. The UI is a little bit more, it's not as end user friendly when you start looking at it. Licensing, there's that difference we've been looking at, per user versus consumption, or fixed pricing via an Azure subscription. That's if you would get a little bit more into, I don't even know where they came up with fixed pricing, Azure subscription. Where would you do fixed pricing? That one's interesting. It's absolutely more consumption-based because you're paying per actions and connectors. Flow creation, web-based designer, web or mobile UI. You've all built flows in Power Automate, I'm assuming, in that it's web-based. You do it all in the UI. Logic Apps does give you some options. You can go fiddle with the JSON definition. You can go create some of these in Visual Studio, but you also do have a web-based designer that we'll take a look at in Logic Apps. Restricting connectors. This is an interesting one, especially if you're in that scenario where you need to restrict them. You're dealing with DLP, different compliance, regulatory things. You can leverage DLP policies right in Power Automate to limit what connectors people can manage. Again, it's a little bit lower barrier to entry, a little bit nicer UI to navigate through. If you need to do the same thing in terms of limiting what services people can connect to in Logic Apps, you're going to have to go start understanding Azure policies, Azure initiatives, and applying those to your subscription so that you can limit some of those. Error handling, you've got a flow checker. I've used a flow checker before where it gives you a list of errors, different issues, so you can go resolve them. Logic Apps just kind of fails to save. You go save it and it says, nope, there's an error. It does highlight the error. This one I haven't found to be a big deal in terms of one being particularly harder than the other to troubleshoot issues in. Your trigger types also differ a little bit. You have automated in both cases, but Logic Apps tends to be more HTTP focused, webhook focused, HTTP calls. You can still do scheduled in both. The one that you'll notice is missing is instant, from the click of a button or from Power Apps. If you have built your flows to respond to someone clicking a button in Power Apps and trigger them instantaneously, or some of those other instant triggers in Power Automate, you're not going to have those when you go build these out in Logic Apps. I should have made this link clickable. I can throw it in the chat if I can find it, or I can send you that link. You can go just look for Power Automate versus Logic Apps, and Microsoft does give you a good breakdown of the comparison between them. So that's what they would call out. What about building them? What does this actually look like when you go through to start creating these? And I will answer that SharePoint question here in just a minute, Joshua. And thanks, I see someone threw the link out there as well. So we looked at pricing. We can be done with those. Billing policies. We can look at this. I might show this. I wasn't originally going to it. I was like, I should go demo this. This is how you would do pay-as-you-go in Power Automate. But here's Power Automate. I already created a demo. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have gone in and seen Power Automate. You have your nice screen here. You have approvals, you have your flows, different templates, connectors. Everything's built into the UI. You can see your whole run history down here, the connectors that are being used. You can go in and edit with Designer. And I don't know about anybody else. I've started one already. When an item is created in a SharePoint list name, start, wait for an approval. And I did approval specifically because this is one difference that in that Microsoft documentation isn't necessarily called out, is you do start seeing some differences between connectors and actions and how they work. So from here, if we wanted to start, wait for an approval, we could then go in and do some sort of condition and look for that approval. So we get the response to the approval here. I don't need the response summary. Where's my approval response? Outcome. So we can do the outcome, and if the outcome is equal to, there we go, outcome. Oh, I can't do, it doesn't let me do outcome. Should be outcome, shouldn't it? It's all goofy. It doesn't want me to do anything in that condition. I have broken my condition. And sometimes you can manage to break Power Automate too. But you get the idea. I can put a condition in there and set up some approval on it. So yeah, live demos are always dangerous. What about Logic Apps? This is what Logic Apps looks like. And before we build one, we're going to go create a new Logic App. So if I am in Azure and I go look for Logic Apps, I have Logic Apps here. You can see I have a few of them built already. You just simply go click Add and create a Logic App. This is going to look very different from this perspective than Power Automate. You're going to have to pick whatever subscription. So this is your Azure subscription you want it in. Resource groups, if you're not familiar with Azure, a resource group is just a grouping of different resources. Think of it as like a folder in your computer. I'm going to stick all these files in this folder. In this case, I'm going to stick this Logic app in this particular folder within my Azure subscription. You do have to give your Logic app a name. So at the end of the day, Logic apps are running in a website. You can't just like go to the website and visit it and see anything, but this could be, we'll do 365 demo 2. You do have to come up with a unique URL that nobody else has used before, because it is just a subdomain under azurewebsites.net that everybody uses. We're going to publish this as a workflow. This is going to be fine. Region is just going to be where that particular Logic app runs. East US, West US, typically you'll pick one close to where you are. If you have data residency reasons, you can pick a particular region there. This is that standard versus consumption that we talked about before, where standard is that enterprise level dedicated resources. You can just flip it to consumption and you'll notice a lot of those extra options go away. And zone redundancy has to do with where Azure's hosted. And if you want this Logic app to use availability zones, whole separate topic. Most of the time, you can leave this disabled. If you want some additional redundancy, some higher availability, you could toggle this over to enabled to enable that zone redundancy. It builds some additional redundancy into your Logic app. Tagging is just a way to tag resources. We don't need to worry about that. After that, all you do, you fill out that subscription resource group name and create, and it's going to go out and submit this for creation. So this is creating a brand new Logic app. This is going to be just like creating a flow in Power Automate. Your subscriptions, kind of like your environment. Once that's created, you can go over to the resource and jump into a Logic App Designer. And you'll start maybe seeing some similarities here between Power Automate. Not the exact same UI, but you get your common triggers, you get recurrence, you can get an HTTP request, a new email is received in Outlook, new tweets, new files on OneDrive. If you go down further, you can start looking through templates. And some of these are going to be a little bit more developer focused, but you may start seeing some templates very similar to how you, or ones you might see in Power Automate, sending an email when a SharePoint list item is modified, getting daily reminders emailed to you, files in Dropbox, creating them in OneDrive. There are templates you can sort through in here, just like you can in Power Automate to get started. Joshua, what is the cost of redundancy? So I should have looked that up, Joshua. I don't know what the cost increase is if you do zone redundancy, if there is one. Should have looked. We can go back and look a minute. Pricing Logic Apps. If they call out zone redundancy at all. They don't call it out here. Maybe if we went and looked at the pricing calculator, they would. It's not going to take a lot of resources. It wouldn't surprise me if zone redundancy is there. You also asked about availability of them, if you know when that's down. Just like Office 365, Azure has a status page. So if something's not running, or you notice issues, you can always go look at the status page for Azure and find Logic Apps and view the status of Logic Apps across all of the different Azure regions. Logic Apps, are the templates generally better quality, those in Power Automate? Not necessarily, Mark. I would say they're about the same. Truth be told, I so rarely start from a template that I've never really done much comparison and contrasting between the two of them. Nothing that I tend to do usually fits into a template. So yeah, I'm with you. I tend to just start from scratch. So let's start from scratch. Let's do a blank Logic App. And people asked about Logic Apps versus Power Automate. And you will notice this starts looking very strangely familiar in terms of how you build these out. So just like in Power Automate, we can choose SharePoint, and we get that same interface where SharePoint, a list item, when an item is created, you get your same dropdown, so you can go drill through and choose your site or type it in. It'll let you pick your list. This is one difference here. One nice thing with Logic Apps is you do start to see some new things. How often do you want to check for items? If you are in Flow, that's not an option. Microsoft has kind of predetermined this on the background of how often they're going to check for an item when an item is created. I know this used to vary based on the plan you have. I did some looking, and I don't know, like it used to be, it would instant was not necessarily instant, or trigger, not triggered, instant, why am I blanking? It's not an instant flow, it's the other one. Instant are from buttons. But I know it used to like check every 5, 10, 15 minutes, even when you were triggering off a new event occurring. Logic Apps, they actually give you that option of, I want to check every 5 minutes. Automated. Thank you, everybody. Barry, Aaron. Yeah, automated. Used to not necessarily be instantaneous. Automated was, we'll kind of poll and check every so often. Logic Apps, you can go in and actually set this down to the second. You can set it at the minute, the hour, if you only want to go check this list once a month. So while it triggers off new items, you have some flexibility there to build when you want to check for new items or how often you want to check for those new items. By default, it's going to go to, I think it was 5 minutes. The parameters, you still have a lot of those other options you have. You can limit columns by view. If you want to go select a view, you can set your time zone and your start time. So if you want to build this to start at some point in time in the future, you can build this out to start in the future. If you go into the settings, you still have like your trigger conditions in your settings for Logic Apps. So very much that same UI that you have when it comes to creating your apps in Power Apps. Or sorry, building your flows in Power Automate. You can go add new steps, and people asked about variables, about conditions. All of those are still there. The one I mentioned was this, if you go look for approvals. I know approvals are always a big one in Power Automate. There is no approval unless you go start integrating some of the third-party services. And you may have noticed, because we're in Azure, there isn't any sort of place where people can go to bulk approve. So if you want to do approvals in Power Automate, you actually have to go into Outlook and do an approval email. If I could spell approval, an approval email in Outlook, and customize it this way. And then when you go in and add your condition, everything is slow. There we go. Add a control, add a condition. You can do something like look at the approval email response or the selected option and do your comparison there, where now my selected response is equal to approved, and build my approval out that way. So again, this could be a good thing. Maybe your users like approval emails better than having the built-in approval process in, rather than having that built-in approval process, in Power Automate. The other thing that you have is connectors. Connectors also vary a little bit. SharePoint, this one already picked up that I was connected to it. You can see down here, it has the change connection. Add a new connection. And this is, again, going to be very similar to the way it worked in Power Automate, where you can go sign in. It'll pop up a dialog box where you can go enter in credentials to connect to your environment. They are stored a little differently, though. We've built out SharePoint, approval email, conditions. If we go back to, let's go ahead and save this. Save it, and this is where you'll see when it fails. Failed to save the Logic app. I don't have any connectors, but it does highlight where that error is, so I could go in, type in my email address there, save it now, save as complete. There is a new designer coming too. I don't know, hopefully, I would assume, again, based on the similarities, we're going to get a new designer in Power Automate as well. But if you click on connectors, it goes to the help. That's not going over to the connectors pane. Let's go back here. Our unsaved changes will be discarded. This is all those other settings around the Logic app. So you do end up getting a lot more. This part isn't necessarily as user-friendly to power users that are building it. The designer is going to be the same. The template's going to be the same. But this is where you start getting into those resources where maybe IT does need to get a little bit more involved in terms of access control. This is going to be who can get to your Logic app, who can't get to it. Your Logic app designer will take you right where we are, back to where we were. If you do want to review the code view, this is actually how a Logic app is built. So you can go see all the JSON behind it, or not a Logic app. This is actually how a Power Automate flow is built as well. If you would go download, export Power Automate, unzip the package and go look through it, you'd actually find the similar JSON behind the scenes, where you can go see all of the JSON. Be very careful editing it. This is the quickest way to break any exported flow, or just as easily to break any Logic app, as start messing with the code, especially for big flows. That being said, it can be very powerful because it's very easy to move stuff around. If you have connector dependencies and you're trying to drag a connector up above one because you need to rearrange your flow, and the web UI prevents it due to some of those dependencies, and you can't put action that depends on another action above it. If you're very, very careful, you can go rearrange it all in JSON and you won't run into any of those issues. Your connections are all API connections. So this is where it was pulling that SharePoint connection from. I have a SharePoint Online connection and Office 365 connection. So any of those logic apps that I build in that resource group or in that subscription can leverage those connections. So if we're going to go back here. Remember, we built it in the subscription, Azure subscription, and we built that Collab 365 resource group. This is what I was talking about. It's think folder-ish, where here's that demo I just created, here's the demo one I had already created, and then here's those two API connections that connect to SharePoint Online and Office 365. So I showed you already how you could do it from right within the UI. If you want to go change them, these are also just standalone resources. So I can click into SharePoint Online and view all the details about this specific connector, the activity log for this connector, when this was invoked. So you can see 8 minutes ago as we were playing with our new one, this connector was invoked. You can go actually start setting security at the connector level. So maybe you have a bunch of logic apps, but only certain people are allowed to access or use certain connections. You can secure connections. If you want to go edit this connection and change the user, you can go in and reauthorize what user you use here as well in terms of those connections. So you do start getting a little bit more granularity. You can also start to see how you do need IT involved, probably to some extent, in terms of setting this up and getting it configured, getting some of these connections tweaked if you need to, managing this more from the Azure perspective. That being said, I also like managing these from the Azure perspective. Anybody that's built a Power Automate flow and had some user build it and didn't know it was out there, didn't know it was running out there, and that user left and all of a sudden the business process stopped working because there were all these flows that were tied to their account that nobody ever realized. Or you have to go through, and they've made this better. You can now go into the environment and see all the flows in there, but you still run into this flow is owned by a particular user. And unless they've gone out and explicitly shared it with somebody, it's only going to show up in their My Flows and their Cloud Flows. And then you have like the Cloud Flows, and then you have the shared with me, and you can't keep track who shared what and who's created what where. In Logic Apps, because it's all owned by that subscription, it's not quite so closely tied to a user. You could argue, well, there's only one user that has access to my Azure subscription, or not everybody can see the Azure subscription. But by and large, it's now owned by the organization. The organization owns the Azure subscription. Almost every organization I've worked with has multiple people that are owners, contributors, readers on these different Azure subscriptions. So it makes it a lot easier to just go into that subscription and see what people have done from a manageability standpoint and from that administrative side of things. By default, Joshua, once you create a subscription, a connection, it's going to inherit or take those permissions from that subscription or the resource group. So kind of like you can do permissions on a folder, you can do permissions on a resource group as well. So this Collab 365 demo resource group, I could go in and manage that access at that resource group level and actually go in and specify, hey, there's Aaron. Aaron's apparently an owner on this subscription. You can go in and specify who can get to this resource group, and then who could use those connections in the resource group. So if I created a second resource group, like a Collab 365 demo to resource group, I could have a different set of logic apps and connections inside that resource group that I have in this one, and permission those two resource groups differently with different API connections in there. Anything else I want to show? So real quickly, because we talked about pay-as-you-go, maybe you're in that boat. We looked at the pricing for premium connectors. We looked at logic apps, but maybe you're looking at this and thinking, oh, can you connect to SharePoint with a managed identity? Let me think. I don't believe so, but I'm trying to think if I've tried it. I don't think you can use a managed identity. Some sort of impersonation. So this one is not going to, I would say, Mark, from an impersonation standpoint, this one probably does more impersonation by default than Power Automate tends to. Because in this one, you're setting up your API connections with a specific user and leveraging these API connections for everything. So I'm assuming that's what you mean by impersonation, so that if you're running the flow, it's not running as you, it's running as that service account, versus you want this to run as you. So that would be another downside, is these aren't going to tend to run as Mark. If a SharePoint list item triggers your flow, it's going to go, or if a SharePoint list item triggers a logic app, it's going to go run that logic app, and it's going to use these API connections to perform any of its actions versus maybe performing all of those actions as you. Because there's no way to go in here, and even with that API connection, like this API connection is running as me. There's no properties or settings in there to say run this or use the user who triggered this logic app and run this connection as them. Using logic apps, is it possible to trigger a PowerShell script from a Microsoft form? Let's go. Look, let's go find one of these. Go edit it. Can't remember if there's a Microsoft Forms connector in here or not. Yes, you can absolutely do a PowerShell script. And I think I did a session on this. I have one. Maybe we should do another one of these too, John, is running PowerShell from these forms. Let's go look. I mean, I have a workaround that you could absolutely do. I don't see actual Microsoft 365 forms in here, but I know you can write forms to a SharePoint list. Oh no, there is Microsoft Forms. Huh, it is in there. When a new response is submitted, there you go. Sign in. So we can go create a Microsoft Forms trigger, connection, connect as me, go connect or collect the form. I think I have some forms out there. Yeah. So you can go do a form, a PowerShell script. This is far and away my favorite connector, and why I go to Logic Apps, because I don't like paying premium subscriptions for this, is automation. And if you go find in Azure, you have this other service called Azure Automation right here that allows you to create a job, which is a runbook, and a job that's a runbook is, oh, see, I gotta go authenticate and do all of that. I'm not gonna authenticate and pull it up. Azure Automation contains runbooks, which can be PowerShell scripts. So you can go into here and say when a new response is submitted, maybe you send an email, and then you go run an Azure Automation runbook. And that is just a PowerShell script that does whatever you want that PowerShell script to do, it runs up in the cloud, so you don't need a server. And just like Logic Apps, Azure Automation is dirt cheap to run. It is also free. I think the first 500 minutes of an Azure Automation runbook actually running. So you write a PowerShell script that takes a minute to run, you can run it 500 times for free. And then after that, I think it's 0.2 of a cent or 25 hundredths of a cent. It's somewhere in that realm. Maybe it's even a fraction. Maybe it's 500ths of a cent. It's fractions of a cent to act per minute to run a PowerShell script. So Mark, using automations in conjunction with PNP to provision sites and apply templates. Yes, absolutely easier than with, well, how about the same as with Power Automate? Maybe easier, because you had someone, Joshua asked about managed identity. You can use your Logic Apps managed identity to run Azure Automation runbooks. So this is really nifty. And yeah, when you start getting into PNP, PowerShell and all of that to do things like provisioning sites, this is a great way to go, especially if you trigger off a SharePoint site. Like you could even build a Power App if you're using Power Apps for people to submit requests for new sites, write it to a SharePoint list, use Logic Apps to trigger off the addition to the SharePoint list, and then go run all your PowerShell scripts with your PNP and all of that in Azure Automation. I've also done this if I want to go manipulate Azure Active Directory and users more than you can with the standard connectors. You can do a lot with PowerShell that you can't do with the standard connectors in either Logic Apps or Power Automate. So I'll go run an Azure Automation runbook that will go update like offices and addresses and mobile phone numbers and office phone numbers and job titles, and it'll go update like 20 or 30 Azure AD properties that you can't actually do without using PowerShell to do them. So if that is usually when I go into Logic Apps right away, is anytime somebody says, I need to run PowerShell for something and I don't have premium licensing in Power Automate, it's like, well, let's go do Logic Apps. It's fractions of a cent per month or a couple dollars per month to go run all this PowerShell via Logic Apps. So maybe you've looked at this, maybe you're like, I don't know that I'm ready to dive into Azure that much, but I still want to do the pay-as-you-go. You're like the 60 cents per flow. It's not that big a deal. It's not worth diving into Logic Apps for everything. I did want to show this because I saw the pay-as-you-go, and it's interesting in how you set it up. It is billed through Azure, so you still need an Azure subscription. So there's a few extra steps if you want to do pay-as-you-go from that configuration standpoint. So if you're in Power Automate and you're over in, do I still have my admin center up? Maybe not. Let's go admin.power platform. What you actually have to do is within policies, you can go down to billing policies now and enter a new billing policy. And this is a group of one or more environments that you bill to Azure. So you can go in now and do build to Azure, and we'll do a collab 365 demo, build to Azure. And this now you have to go search for a subscription. So this is that same subscription. You actually have to use a resource group. This region is not an Azure region. This has to match the region that your Power Platform environment is in. So if you built your Power Platform environment in the United States, this has to match it. And then you can go select what environment you want to enable pay per go licensing for those Power Automate flows. One caveat, I did not notice this until I went to go set this up for somebody. You cannot use your default environment. you have to create a brand new environment for the Power Platform if you want to do pay-as-you-go. So none of these are my default environment. There's no way to get my default environment as an option. I have a bunch of issues with this, particularly the fact that you run into issues with quotas around Dataverse. So if you go look at your, not your analytics, but your resources and your capacity, if you're not paying for premium subscriptions, you don't have capacity to create another environment. So you end up getting this really weird scenario where you need a new environment because you can't use your default one in order to go select that environment to turn on pay-per-go licensing in and pay that 60 cents per flow. So annoying. They either should let you turn it on in the default environment, or they should let you create at least one other production environment without having to worry about capacity so that you can use pay-per-go billing. I think I figured out a way around it, and I can't remember what I did. I think I used a trial license to create a new environment. Don't tell Microsoft this. This has been doing it, not necessarily obeying the rules. I think I used a trial license to create a new environment, and then I just let the trials expire once I had the new environment. And when I went and looked at my capacity, I was like over capacity in the environment I did this in. But unless Microsoft audits you, I don't know that it matters. But that is absolutely not approved or endorsed in any way. And John said I'll edit that out of the recording. Thanks. Inside tricks. Because yeah, otherwise you have to go buy capacity, and I think capacity is like $40 per month for additional database capacity, so you can create that second environment. It's a pain. So that is an overview. Let me see what other slides. I think I had like one or two more slides. I lost my Teams client. Stop the sharing and jump into the slides here for a second. And I have more time. I know this was scheduled for 2 hours. Someone said they wanted all 2 hours. I will give you all 2 hours if you want to sit around and talk. Migrating. We've talked about all this. Maybe you have a bunch of Power Automate flows that you want to migrate to Logic Apps. It is possible. Microsoft does give you this link, this documentation. There are some conditions, some things you have to be aware of. It absolutely messes with some of the connectors because connectors are a little bit different. But it is possible to migrate. Go look at all the documentation if that's something you're interested in. Test it out. I did want to leave you with that. It actually used to be easier, and I think as the platforms have evolved and you get some differences, maybe it was causing issues and they didn't want to make it quite so easy. Power Automate used to have an export to Logic Apps option in it, and they've taken that away. So now you kind of have to go through a few extra steps. But end of the day, Power Automate is built on Logic Apps. The JSON formatting, a lot of that's the same. You just run into some goofy permission stuff, connector stuff, those types of things. So with that, if anybody has any questions or wants to see anything else, feel free to hang around. I can go cover anything else. If you have questions and you don't want to ask them in the chat or on audio here, feel free to shoot me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn, connect with me on Twitter. I am still on Twitter. It's still alive, barely, given the day. I saw Facebook Threads is coming out tomorrow. I may have to give that a shot, but I am still on Twitter for the time being, if you want to connect with me there. So yeah, any other questions? I've been kind of watching the chat. I don't know if there's any new ones in there that I missed.
Was one around, funny to say Twitter, actually, there was one around connectors around Twitter, and I had a couple of questions myself, just of things we've been doing. But do you know if the Twitter API is still supported now that lots of things have changed? That'd be interesting. Yeah.
I bet it's not. My guess would be no.
Yeah.
But maybe there's so few people using Twitter and Microsoft products that it works. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't tested it. My assumption would be no, but I have not tried it since that all happened.
Cool. In terms of integrations, like Power Automate is fantastic. We use it a lot for things like integrations to Teams and using my identity without me really caring through the Office 365 groups connectors. Do you know if does that stuff exist in Logic Apps as well? So Teams is one question, and the Office 365 groups, do they exist?
Those, yeah, by and large, I have found. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to share my screen. By and large, I found most of those exist. The biggest one that doesn't exist is the approvals. But because they're kind of built on the same thing, well, the connectors may vary some. Come on, why isn't Teams? Well, the connectors vary some. I haven't found very many that are in one and not the other. And as I say that,
we just found one, huh?
I was sure Teams was in here.
Oracle Skype for Business.
Office 365 groups was mentioned.
Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty handy one for us.
Outlook, there's Azure AD. You've got Forms, 365 Video, 365. Here's your groups, Office 365 groups, and here's Teams.
Oh, okay.
Imagine that, Microsoft not being great at search. Did I say that out loud?
I'm editing
MSN
that too,
Messenger. So yes, Teams is there. Microsoft 365 Groups is there. Azure AD is there. But yeah, this is where you see too, like all of a sudden it just loses all that premium stuff. Like you can just go in and select any of these without worrying about if they're standard. And those may actually all fall under standard. Enterprise? I think those are enterprise. I think premium translates to enterprise most of the time.
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, as you said, Ben, if there are other questions, pop them in chat. Ben's hanging around for a little bit. As you think about that, I'm just going to say a massive thank you, Ben, for illuminating that for us. That's something you'd sort of hinted at before, and when we heard about this, it sounded really exciting. But there's a lot to digest there, isn't there? It's like the wrapper around it, the sort of what you call classical operations and IT and security wrapper. You need some thought to be given to that. However, the function of the thing itself is Power Automate.
Yeah, I was looking. Oh, Mark did the JSON hacking too. Mark, I don't think that's technically supported, but I've absolutely done it. Mark, cool. Easy to migrate between tenants. When I build Power Apps, so migrate Power or Power Automate. So migrate Power Automate flows between tenants. Is that?
Yeah, I'll come off. I'll come off mute. So yeah, so when we migrate Power Automate flows from one tenant to the other, so you're building a solution for a customer and you deploy it. When you do that in Logic Apps, is there anything more creative in there? So when it arrives in the destination environment, it'll kind of run because the way I build things in Flow is I variabilize everything. So at the other end, I can just switch the variables and it'll just find my site, find my list. Do we have the same logic in Logic Apps?
So the same thing is there in Logic Apps in terms of being able to variabilize everything and set that up. I have not tried to migrate a Logic app. So this is going to take. So what this ends up doing is it exports it as an ARM template to deploy into a new Azure subscription. So it's going to still have a lot of those connections. I would think this would work a lot the same way. It is possible that if you have variables, maybe you could go in, because the JSON's easier to get to, that you could like pre-store some of those items in there a little bit easier and maybe make it a little bit more portable because you have access to the JSON and the ARM template instead of however Microsoft decides to pre-package stuff when it comes out of Power Automate.
Yeah, well, it's just JSON and the zip file, but yeah, I'm no stranger to JSON hacking.
To manipulating
It's not
all that. Yeah.
It's not supported like you say, but sometimes it works a treat.
Yeah, Logic App just gives you a little bit more insight into some of that stuff, and I would say supported accessibility to it in terms of what you're allowed or not allowed to do.
Oh, thank you.
What else? I don't know. I've never looked for MySpace connector, Rick. We could start dating ourselves. MSN Messenger. What about AOL Instant Messenger? Any AOL Instant Messenger connectors? My wife still has an AOL email address, and I make fun of her all the time for it.
So look, if you are heading off, certainly going to say a big thank you for joining us and a big thank you to Ben. If you want to stick around and ask questions, you absolutely can do. We are going to put this recording into the Academy. Yeah, definitely give Ben a big round of applause for that. Just a reminder, it will go in the Academy. If you do want to get in there and you're not already in there, I'll pop another link for one more time. Shameless sales plug, but we do love to see people join the Academy. Pop in, grab a platinum subscription. It gives you 7 days to go and review this. You can then choose to carry on, or you've had enough. Enjoy the community though after that if you do choose to not take it forwards, and we hope to see you take more. But we've got some more live stuff coming up. Before I wrap up and say thank you to you, Ben, we're going to do a bit of a live stream tomorrow. I'm going to dig around if anybody's got any interest into the world of testing. It might be quite niche, but never know. I'm going to play on the live stream with the new testing features that you can use for Power Apps a little bit. And then on Friday, Connor's going to go and look into his learning management system. So if you've got an interest in Power Apps, the Dataverse to a degree, and learning management, he's going to do that live for free again on Friday. And then we've got a great workshop coming up at the end of the month. So yeah, go and have a look at all that good stuff. But hey, Ben, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Not a problem. And thanks for everybody that stuck around that is jumping off. Appreciate it. And I did see one question there from, I saw it and I lost it. Asked about billing. So you can go in, and I just popped this up too. If you're curious about billing and where your cost is coming from, that is one of the nice things about Logic Apps is it does give you some of that service apps. Logic Apps has cost me 8 cents so far. I don't know. Can I get down to the connector level? This may be due to some of the storage. I was actually surprised it was 8 cents. Where would connectors? Don't know unless I get into. Can't do cost. I don't think it has cost analysis on the resource itself, but you could do it on the resource group in the demo2 metrics, diagnostic logs. Yeah, it doesn't have billing at this level. The metrics are just going to give you latency, actions completed. So you could go figure it out from here. Some of the metrics for the Logic Apps, if you wanted to see how many actions were completed, how many actions were started. You asked about like billable. If you want to see billable action executions, trigger executions, usage for standard connectors. So some of that's going to be down in this monitoring and reporting within the Logic App itself. So this is another aspect that we could have called out as well, is there's a lot more access, I would say, to analytics and logs within Logic Apps than there is within Power Automate. One of my monitors just started acting up. I might have to stand up and move and turn it back on.
That's surely an exercise in getting RSI, isn't it? Having your monitor over your shoulder.
Yeah, well, so I have one monitor here, and then the monitor I have everything that I'm shared on is out here.
Ah,
But
cool.
this is completely off topic. It is a Teams room device. So it's designed to be in conference rooms. And as such, like it has a timeout feature. And I think it has issues sometimes detecting if the monitor is being actively used or not. So yeah, it just turned off on me. So I had to like refresh the signal going to it to get it to pick up the fact that I'm still using it.
Or it's become sentient and it is protecting you against future defamation on behalf of Microsoft. It's like, I'm not listening to this. I'm going to cut it off.
Yeah, but if you ever want one, shameless plug, I've done. It's this right here, this Neat board.
Oh, nice.
It's pretty slick. It's a 65-inch Teams room device, so it has a camera built into it and audio and all that.
Fantastic. That's a good bit of kit. I think we're at a point, Ben, aren't we? And thank you everyone who's stuck around. If you do have any more questions, pop them in. But I think we're at a point where yeah, we've shared what you wanted to share today, I presume.
Yeah, that's everything I have. So again, thank you all for showing up for all the questions. I love all the good questions. So it's always fun to answer those and to have the participation. So appreciate the opportunity as well, John. Thanks for having me back to
It's always fantastic,
talk
Ben.
about it.
Always learn loads. Thank you. And you're always very welcome back. And we'll continue to do these free events because we know part of being community is giving like information and knowledge. So yeah, really appreciate it. I think we'll say goodbye for now to everyone. And yeah, if you are with us, catch the recording. It'll take a little while just to get all of Ben's Ben's defamation stuff edited out, but it should be there tomorrow for you to watch it back and hopefully convince everybody that there are other options as well as the Power Platform. Not saying always dive for it because it's not always the right choice, but lots of options, and that's what it's about, really, isn't it? Many ways to cut this cookie.
Yes, absolutely. And always looking for ways you can save money too, right? Save money, different options, flexibility.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I will stop the recording and let you all go and enjoy your day and enjoy the post July the 4th events, Ben, if that is such a thing. I don't know.